I think the world's most famous caribou scientist, worked in the Yukon with Environment Canada for more than 30 years. And Don was talking earlier today about a phenomenon that perplexes us for decades as to why we see caribou populations collapse and then bounce back. Beginning of IP, why we saw a collapse? Have we seen them bounce back?
Yeah, well, the network that I try to coordinate is a circumpolar network, and it's meant to look at the impacts of global change on these large migratory caribou herds. So we have about 22 herds around the globe that we're trying to monitor, and in 2006, I would say the vast majority of those herds were in decline, and there was a lot of concern. There's a lot of concern in the media. And then in the last estimates of these herds, I would say we're down to maybe 3 or 4 that are still in decline, maybe a little bit more, but most of them either have bottomed out, they're stabilized, and some of them have shown some pretty encouraging increases.
Which ones are still in decline?
Inland Gava, northern Quebec, we're in Quebec now, but the George River, Leaf River herds are in decline. The 3 of the 5 Russian herds are in decline. And there's a little bit of a problem there because they haven't really been estimated in maybe the last 10 years. And all previous estimates show that they were in decline from some pretty high numbers. The largest, the Taimyr herd, topped out in 2000 of just over 1 million animals. It may be down to about 600,000 now.
That's quite a drop.
Yeah, it is. But if you look at some of the central barrens, the Bathurst herd was estimated at about 500,000 in the early 80s, and it went down to about 32,000. So, over a 90% drop in some of those herds.
Bathurst herd is the population we see in Central.
Right. It's the herd that sort of is north of Yellowknife. Bathurst Inlet is close to its capital.
We'll just go back with the Bathurst herd is in the Central Arctic.
Yes.
North of Yellowknife.
North of Yellowknife. It has, Bathurst Inlet is close to where its calving grounds are, and then it travels south into the winter range, can even get into northern Saskatchewan.
And the cycles, in terms of years, how many years? Are we talking decadal, any longer periods than that?
Well, since we've been doing sort of modern estimates, the early 1970s, late 1960s, most populations around the globe were quite low, very low. And then they peaked out in general around 1995 to 2000, and then started to decline. So it's about a 40-year cycle that we've seen, this one cycle. But we know that just from traditional knowledge and talking to people in communities that these herds have been at population highs maybe 3 times in the last century. So 30 or 40 years is quite consistent.
And we know why it's 30 or 40 years? I mean, is there a guess, or do we have good knowledge as to why this is happening?
It's kind of like the $64,000 question. It's not worth much these days, but it's hard. We know there's some response to some of these global climate oscillations, but these oscillations are shorter time frame. There's some discussion of the movement of the Arctic front. But just when there is some synchrony in these herds, there's a tremendous amount of variability. There's some herds, for example, on the Alaska coastal plain from the 1970s on, that never declined, they've always increased. They're showing some signs now that they may start to decline. Some of the productivity numbers that are coming out shows that they may be on the verge of starting to decline. So there's tremendous variability, so you can't really pinpoint it to any particular index we have out there of climate.
So is it fair to say that the past is not necessarily a good indication of what's going to happen in the future?
Well, certainly this, and as I say, most populations are low and some are starting to creep up again. And we have there's sort of unprecedented changes between this population low and what we saw in the 1960s. There's a lot more development. There's a lot, depending on where you are on the globe, there's different factors in the environment that are changing in terms of climate. Primarily, these herds are hunted by Aboriginal communities, and they're much more efficient now in terms of their hunting abilities. So what we may see is that as some of these herds bottom out, it might take a little longer for some of them to respond. If the climate change has actually been positive for them, they might respond faster. In other words, they may cancel each other out. So, yeah, I think we certainly can't sit back and say, well, they've cycled for 300 or 400 years or maybe before that, and therefore they'll continue to cycle. I think we certainly have to be prudent with our management and come up with some management prescriptions on how to manage these herds through the cycle. But what do you monitor and what management actions do you take when these herds are increasing, when you start seeing signs that they're going to decline?
Well, give us an example of how you would manage a herd so that it does survive those cycles.
Well, you don't wait for them to bottom out to start negotiating or discussions or consulting on how to cut back, say, on some of the harvesting. We should be able to anticipate that and act sooner, and it would have less of a boom and bust in terms of people's ability to harvest. And the ideal thing is some very steady, consistent, reliable harvest right through the cycle. And I think, with enough discussion and enough analysis of how these cycles occur, I think those things are possible.
Do we have any models of any other wildlife populations that we've managed extremely well? No. So I mean, we're working from ground zero here. We're really trying to. And tell us a little bit more about your organization and what they're trying to do.
Yeah, well, what we're trying to do is start to get people monitoring these herds in the same way. We're trying to understand what makes these cycles, and on an individual herd basis, what makes them different from the long-term norm. And we're involving the remote sensing scientists, we're involving the population biologists, the management agencies, co-management groups, community leaders. So in other words, we went sort of the whole package there at the table discussing these issues. It's a non-confrontational, informal gathering. There's no politics involved, as much as you can keep it out of it.
How did you monitor herds in 30 years ago when you started, 35 years ago when you started?
Well, the techniques haven't really changed much. We have a benefit of technology a lot more now in terms of GPS systems and satellite collars and conventional radio collars, GPS collars. So it's a little easier to find these herds now. We know a lot more. They're on the air 365 days a year, so you know roughly where the bulk of the herd is sitting in your desk. In Montreal, you know roughly where the Leaf River herd is that day. So it's certainly streamlined. I think our population estimate's a lot more reliable, but it's the same method. There's two main methods of counting these large herds. Is on the calving grounds where females come traditionally, we would fly a sample of the area, roughly what proportion of the herd goes to the calving grounds, and then you can extrapolate to the rest. And the other method is waiting until they form those gigantic aggregations in July caused by insects, and you essentially photograph the entire herd and count them. It's a total count. Those are the two main methods that are used everywhere.
You've been following the fate of the porcupine caribou for the longest time. Were you surprised by the latest results of the survey, which showed that their numbers have actually increased? Many people were predicting that they were going to decline.
Yeah, well, I was surprised, but in hindsight, I shouldn't have been. The porcupine herd went at a population high of 178,000 in 1989, and then started declining to the low was 123,000, which was not a dramatic decline compared to some central barons. That herd, for whatever reason, there was attempts every 2 or 3 years. That was in 2001, that low number. And they never really got a count until 2011. They just didn't cooperate. They didn't stay out on the coastal plain. And the method that we use in that herd is photographing those large aggregations. So in the interim, there was quite an effort by the co-management board, that Porcupine Caribou co-management board, to really get a handle on harvest strategy and how we can ensure that there's harvest, but avoid, taking females, switch to the bulls, and come up with some thresholds and population levels where certain management actions kick in. And when we tried to project the population, we assumed the worst case scenario in terms of adult cow mortality and harvest levels. And you project that, and that herd should have still been declining. It rebounded, and then there was a managed scramble to really analyze some of that satellite data. And it showed that a tremendous number of females were surviving, a lot more than normal. Normally for the porcupine herd, 16 to 17% of the adult females will die every year, and that really limits the rate of growth of that herd. But in the last 7-8 years, there's been 5% that died, so that's 3 times better survival rates. And you plug those into the equations, and man, we would have predicted the number that they were estimating in 2011, which is 170,000 animals.
Let me ask you one last question. If you were to look in the crystal ball, would we have in 50 years still the great migrations of caribou in the Canadian Arctic, the Russian Arctic?
I think if we start to better understand these herds, I see no reason why we can't still see them in 50 years.
Great. Thank you, John Russell.
Okay, thank you.